Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Robbani. Hello, Moin. Thank you for tuning in.
Hi, Nasim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise, likewise. Um, we want to start off with a breaking story, actually, with the latest in the South African genocide case against Israel at the ICJ, International Court of Justice. The South African team are saying that they have further evidence to prove motive that Israel is committing genocide. And on that topic, we will stick to the legal aspect and focus a bit more on the ICC as well. The latest development from there, there's been a request for one of the judges to leave the ICC case. What does that mean? I want to get your thoughts on that more as well. And then we'll shift to northern Gaza, where the entire population, according to the United Nations, is at risk of dying in northern Gaza. And and then we'll speak a little bit about the UN. Israel is seeking to shut down, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. So what's the latest on that? And then Israel's bombing of Iran over the weekend, which was the big story. We spoke about it last week. But I want to get more thoughts on that as well. And we'll finish off with a discussion on the US election. Um, a group of Muslims have endorsed Trump, while Harris has continued to support Israel's genocide in Gaza. And also a recent development, I think is an important development, of lawyers in the Department of Justice pressing the Attorney General to open an inquiry into Israel's violation of US law. So that's a lot for us to cover today, Moin. But let's begin, as I said, with the latest in South Africa's genocide case
Yeah.
against Israel in the ICJ. The South African team have said that they have what they would call evidence to prove that the intent to commit genocide is clear in their eyes. So, do you want to give us some insight onto what this evidence of clear intent they are speaking about that has been presented to the ICJ?
Yeah, so this is an interesting story because if you recall, about a month or two ago, all of a sudden, the Israeli press was full of stories that South Africa had approached the International Court of Justice in desperation, asking for an extension of the deadline in which to submit its case against Israel because it didn't have any evidence and still needed to find evidence. That was, of course, all yet one more concoction by the Hasbara machine in Israel. What actually happened is that South Africa was given a deadline to file its full case against Israel, and that was this week. And not only has South Africa met that deadline, but in the course of composing its legal brief, the South African legal team was ordered not to include things past a certain deadline because it had so much evidence and needed to cut off somewhere. So perhaps surprisingly, the Israel's virtually unprecedented onslaught on the northern Gaza Strip during the month of October has been completely left out of the South African filing on the grounds that they already had so much evidence that they weren't going to also incorporate this. Now, in interviews, representatives of the South African legal team have said that as far as they're concerned, it's an open shut case, that Israel's conduct that Israel's conduct is a textbook case of genocide, in their words. And then there's some discussion about the extraordinarily high bar of proving genocide and proving it before the International Court of Justice, because for South Africa to succeed, it doesn't only have to demonstrate that Israel undertook certain actions. If it's only able to do that, Israel would be guilty of no more, if I can put it that way, than war crimes and crimes against humanity. To be guilty of genocide, Israel would not only need to conduct these actions, but to have conducted them with an explicit intent to eliminate the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip in whole or in part. So it would have to demonstrate intent, and it would then have to demonstrate that, for example, genocidal statements by Israeli leaders were not just rhetoric, were not just, Israeli generals and politicians being insane, but that these statements actually served as directives for commanders and soldiers in the field. In other words, South Africa also needs to prove a clear and explicit link between what was being said and what was being done. And the South African legal representatives make clear that, in their view, the case is incontrovertible, that not only do they have a surfeit of evidence to demonstrate intent, not only do they have massive amounts of evidence to demonstrate genocidal conduct, but in their view, they have also managed to establish a very clear link between intent and action. So now Israel has to submit its brief. I'm not quite sure when their deadline is. I think it's also in the coming days or weeks. And once that has been completed, then the International Court of Justice will begin a full hearing into the case, and that is expected to take several years. Just briefly to recap, what's happened thus far is that in December of last year, South Africa presented its case against Israel before the International Court of Justice pursuant to the Genocide Convention. In other words, it accused Israel of violating the Genocide Convention by engaging in genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. The International Court of Justice held what might be called a preliminary hearing, in which it essentially had to choose between two options: either to dismiss this as a frivolous lawsuit, or to determine that South Africa's accusations were plausible. In other words, that Israel was plausibly engaging in genocide, and to move forward with the case. And it chose, as we all know, the latter, because it felt that South Africa presented a sufficiently compelling accusation and Israel a sufficiently weak rebuttal that it was time to move forward with this case. Just one other aspect that I think is interesting is that since December, South Africa has, on, I believe, 4 occasions, returned to the International Court asking the ICJ to pronounce on additional provisional measures based on increasingly horrific Israeli conduct in the Gaza Strip. And some may have found it surprising that this month, in response to Israel's offensive in the northern Gaza Strip, where they were preventing even the entry of water, shelling hospitals, summary executions, killing something like 1,000 people in the space of 10 or 14 days. Some people were surprised that on this case, South Africa didn't once again return to the International Court of Justice. Well, now we know why. Its lawyers have certainly these past weeks been extraordinarily busy compiling their brief and putting the final touches on it and presenting it to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. I'm unfortunately unclear about whether, and if so, when this document will be made public. It's said to run to some 500 pages, but it will certainly make for a very, very fascinating and also very, very sordid reading once it becomes available.
So we know, of course, Israel's being investigated not only at the ICJ for genocide in Gaza, but also at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And our progress there has been, let's just say, more slow.
That's putting it lightly.
Yeah. And last week we spoke about a smear campaign against the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan. And over the past few days, one of the judges, Judge Iulia Motoc, I think I'm pronouncing her name properly, requested to be excused from the case. I mean, what do we know about that, and what does that mean? When one judge says they want to be excused, what's the reason for wanting to be excused, and is that going to have further? Well, is that going to further stall any progress? In addition to that, I should mention that the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan, in further development to the conversation we had last week, apparently he tried to suppress sexual misconduct claim against him. So that's the latest news on that smear campaign. So things don't look to be moving smoothly with the ICC as much as the ICJ case.
Yes, and here I think we need to make a clear distinction between the International Court of Justice, which is one of the principal organs of the United Nations, and the International Criminal Court, which is not part of the United Nations, which, in contrast to the ICJ, deals with individual criminal responsibility, but is also much more susceptible to pressures and blandishments and all the rest of it from key states, including those who have refused to either ratify the Rome Statute or become members of the ICC. One can think, for example, of most prominently the United States and Israel. The backstory here, of course, is that the ICC has for years been dragging its feet on what the case that is called the situation in the state of Palestine. It's quite clear that the ICC has done its very best to avoid this case like the plague, for the very simple reason that the ICC does not want to upset the Western powers. There's a reason people have been calling it the International Criminal Court for Africa or the International Caucasian Court, because if you look at its record, it really has gone primarily after Africans and more recently after official enemies of the West. So we have the case, for example, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the arrest warrants issued against Russian President Vladimir Putin. I think this is notable, not because it says anything necessarily about Russia, but if one looks at the speed with which the ICC was willing to issue an arrest warrant for the leader of the second most powerful state in human history, who happens to be a Western adversary, and the snail's pace with which it has begun to even consider a serious investigation into Israeli conduct against the Palestinians, it kind of tells you all you need to know about the ICC. Now, regarding these latest developments, as you know, in May of this year, as part of an investigation which actually commenced in 2021, should have started much earlier, but finally commenced in I believe late 2020 or early 2021, the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan sought to issue arrest warrants for 5 individuals regarding the Palestine case. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 Hamas leaders, Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Deif. 2 of the 3 Palestinians are now known to have been killed. Regarding the third, he is reported to have been killed, but the status is unconfirmed. Khan, who has elevated postponement and procrastination into an Olympic sport, in the end was forced to move only because of the enormous pressure that had been brought to bear upon the institution and his office by global public opinion, by members of the ICC's Assembly of State Parties, in other words, states that are ICC members, and last but certainly not least, by his own peers in the legal profession. And the way that the ICC works is the prosecutor doesn't issue indictments. The Office of the Prosecutor sends applications to a panel of judges known as the pretrial chamber that then assess these applications and on their basis decide whether to endorse or reject the application. What was strange in this case, and we've spoken about this on several occasions, is that Khan immediately made his application to the pretrial chamber public. It's an unusual method to do so. This then created an opportunity of several months for first the United Kingdom, then of course Germany, others who are not even members of the ICC, like the United States, to basically send objections to the ICC and make the case once again that as far as they're concerned, the fundamental principle of international law is that Israel is allowed to commit crimes with total impunity. That's kind of where international law begins for them. Then the pretrial chamber set several deadlines for receiving these interventions from states and organizations and individuals arguing either for or against the validity of ICC jurisdiction in this case. And it then gave the prosecutor a deadline to submit his response to these interventions. In doing so, it basically postponed considerations of the application for arrest warrant by from May to August or September, I think. Then, just as we were expecting the pretrial chamber to finally do its job, one of the three judges, Iulia Motoc, I believe from Romania, requested to be taken off the case on health grounds. Now, on the one hand, it's entirely possible that she has a medical condition that required her to leave the case. At the same time, the timing of this request is highly suspicious because it came at a moment that would lead to further delays in this case, because she's been now replaced by another judge, I believe from Slovenia, who will now, of course, take several weeks, if not months, to acquaint herself with the case, go through the various submissions and files so that she can participate in the decision on the application for arrest warrants. And so, I certainly think that the ICC needs to be a little more transparent here. They don't need to release this judge's medical records, of course. That would be a gross invasion of privacy. But in the context of this constant delay and procrastination, in the context of what we know are concerted efforts by Israel, primarily, to interfere with the administration of justice by the ICC, given all the threats that have been made against the court by senior American politicians, we are entitled to know, has she requested to be taken off this case because of a genuine medical condition, or has cowardice or submission to blackmail is that now being defined as a serious medical condition, in which case, of course, that needs to be reported. And she and any other ICC officials implicated in this issue need to be immediately expelled from the court and prosecuted under, I believe it's Article 60 or 70 of the Rome Statute, making interference with the administration of justice a criminal offense. So, you have all these delays and procrastination, and then you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? Well, I'm speculating, but of course, a core principle of the ICC is complementarity. And that basically means that the ICC will not prosecute any case where national courts are launching credible investigations or prosecutions of the individuals concerned for the same crimes they stand accused of before the ICC. And I suspect that what is happening in the background is that Israel's Western sponsors and allies are seeking to impress upon the Israeli government that it needs to very rapidly launch a sham investigation into Netanyahu and Gallant so that the ICC can then say that they will, await the conclusion of the investigation, potentially the conclusion of a trial in the fourth millennium, so that, they can continue not to take any meaningful action on this file. That's kind of where things stand regarding the pretrial chamber. And then, lo and behold, this week, news broke that the prosecutor, Karim Khan, stands accused of, let's call it, inappropriate behavior towards one of his assistants in the office of the prosecutor, of making sexual advances and the like on this individual. That this individual initially, although detailing to colleagues Khan's behavior, did not intend to file an official complaint against him that would lead to an investigation, but then appears, the details are a little unclear, but appears to have been bullied by I think it's called the Office of Internal Management of the ICC into pressing a case against Khan. But the real story is that this entire issue that we're now discussing was leaked to the press, along even with suggestions that the reason that Khan applied for arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant was to divert attention from this case regarding his personal conduct, whereas in reality, the case, the warrants precede the genesis of this entire case. Now, we don't know who was behind this. It could be Russia, it could be Angola, it could be Colombia. But when we look at the record of the ICC, one country is known to have conducted the lion's share, let's call it the safari's share, of attempted interference, of espionage, of blackmail, of threats against International Criminal Court officials. That country, of course, is Israel. So here again, it's a valid assumption that Israel is once again seeking to derail the court's investigation into Israel. Why? Well, because Israel has absolutely no intention of using complementarity to stave off this investigation. Israel is certainly not going to launch an investigation of Netanyahu and Gallant, even a sham investigation, to ensure that there is no ICC investigation. Because, when you're engaged in genocide, the absolute last thing you're going to do is to launch cases against your own senior officials and suggest that there is somehow something wrong with seeking to exterminate an entire group of people.
It is worth observing the two main legal bodies in the world, the ICC and the ICJ, doing its thing. And while there is a live genocide taking place, and I think it's good way to judge the efficacy of these organizations. I think it's one of the arguments that was presented by the South African team in their evidence gathering when, I mean, they said that there's continued violations of international law, there's continued genocidal intent being expressed within Israel, which means they have to work double hard to gather the evidence and present it to the ICJ. And likewise, I think the same is the case with the ICC, where you are seeing genocide taking place in front of your eyes, live stream, and at the same time, as you mentioned, the procrastination and the delay. So it really brings to question the efficacy of, especially in this case, the ICC, given that we are watching the genocide being live streamed on our screens. And nowhere more so than what is happening now in northern Gaza. According to the UN, the entire population in northern Gaza is at risk of dying. And we're seeing horrific scenes from there, and there are now proposals as well from the US on how to manage northern Gaza after some kind of a ceasefire. And some of the suggestions that have been touted is to have a gated communities in inverted commas, and also mercenaries to police northern Gaza. It seems like a concentration camp more than anything else, but these are some of the ideas that have been touted. But what is the situation at the moment in northern Gaza? The UN, as I said, has mentioned that the entire population, which could mean we're looking at figures at the moment. Some estimates suggest that the death toll is as high as 200,000. Of course, officially, Gaza Ministry of Health has said it's something like 43,000, but it could be as high as 200,000, who knows? And if the UN is correct, that the entire population in northern Gaza is at risk, we could be looking at hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who could potentially die from Israel's genocidal policy.
Yeah. Well, of course, you forgot to follow the sterling example of BBC and start your statement by immediately casting doubt on it by saying the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health, as if every nurse, doctor, and ambulance driver is somehow a commander in the Qassam brigades and doesn't know how to register deaths. But if I could just start with a very brief comment on the first part of your question. The International Court of Justice is certainly not beyond reproach, but the criticisms that one would make of it are of a very different nature. This is a court that already in 2004 determined that Israel's West Bank wall was illegal. This is a court that this July determined that the occupation itself is illegal and unlawful and illegitimate and needs to end as rapidly as possible. This is a court that actually considered South Africa's accusations of genocide against Israel to be sufficiently plausible to hold a full hearing on it. And if you look at the way the ICJ has moved on the Palestine genocide case relative to other genocide cases, there's really nothing to criticize it for. It hasn't been dragging its feet. It hasn't been refusing to fulfill its duties. And at the end of the day, yes, they could have issued perhaps different and stronger provisional measures, but we're not talking about a national court that has its own enforcement mechanisms. This is a court that could only basically issue rulings, and it is for others to ensure that those rulings are implemented. Those others, of course, being primarily states that have absolutely no intention of seeing these provisional measures implemented. With the ICC, it's a very different problem, and we've already discussed it, so I'm not going to repeat it, but I do think it's important to make that distinction. Turning to the northern Gaza Strip, again, what we're dealing with here is an Israeli campaign to basically separate the northern Gaza Strip from the southern Gaza Strip, which it has already done by seizing what's called the Netzarim corridor, which basically divides Gaza City and everything north from the central and southern regions of the Gaza Strip. And what's happened in the past month is that Israel launched an additional offensive to isolate the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, the Jabalia refugee camp, and the town of Jabalia from Gaza City, the rest of this area. And in that northern enclave, if you will, Israel has systematically prevented the entry of food, the entry of water, the entry of medication. It has systematically attacked the hospitals there. It has prevented any aid convoys from entering, and those that are allowed to go to Gaza City rather than these towns I just mentioned. And perhaps the single most cynical act of this entire genocidal campaign, the United States, in the as represented by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, several weeks ago, it issued a public letter to Israel, or I think it was a private letter that was leaked, or however one wants to put it, that if Israel does not begin to address this humanitarian catastrophe within 30 days, that there could be consequences for U.S. aid, military aid to Israel under U.S. domestic legislation. Now, it only takes an individual 3 to 4 days to die of dehydration. Everyone, it's like you've said, it's being live streamed what's happening. This policy of starvation, this policy of dehydration. Israel has bombed the last remaining fire truck in the northern Gaza Strip. Desperate members of these communities are having to dig through tons of rubbles, more or less with their bare hands, to try to either rescue loved ones, wives, husbands, parents, children, or at least to retrieve their bodies. There are decomposing bodies in the streets. The hospitals are being invaded. And then for the Americans to say, you can only do this for 30 more days, and if you don't succeed by then, we're going to get angry. I think it really has to be seen as probably the single most cynical maneuver that we've seen in the entirety of the past year. So that's basically where things stand, and Israel is next expected to seek to apply a similar campaign in Gaza City. We're talking here about, hundreds of thousands of people that still remain in the northern Gaza Strip, either because they can't evacuate south of the Netzarim corridor, or refuse to, or in many cases are too terrified to do this, because of course there's been repeated cases of Israel forcibly displacing people to what are termed safe evacuation zones, then bombing and sniping at them, not only as they are evacuating, but then also bombing and sniping at them within these evacuation zones once they arrive there. And of course, all they have to do is say it was Hamas, and then the Americans and the Germans will say, "Oh, this is self-defense. Israel has a right to slaughter civilians." But sorry, I think I missed part of your question.
I mean, it was I made a point about day after plan, where American officials or former officials
Yes.
like General Petraeus
Yes.
discussing creating gated communities, which is another way of saying, concentration camps
Yes.
in Gaza, and having them policed by mercenaries, and having Palestinians go in and out through some kind of DNA, or some kind of a mechanism. Yeah, that's the policy that's being discussed in the US.
Yes.
Petraeus, he is the retired US Army general, and he presented that as a solution for the Israelis.
Yeah, and
Uh,
laughed while he was doing it.
and laughed while he was doing it. He said it worked for us in Iraq. I mean, how did it
Yeah.
work in Iraq? I don't know, but that's how he presented that as a concentration camp for
Yeah.
Palestinians, which he calls gated communities,
Yeah.
and policed by mercenaries. It was quite a
Yeah.
shocking thing to hear.
Yeah, and this is of course the day after plan. You know, you put Palestinians in concentration camps in the Gaza Strip. You look the other way as Israel annexes the West Bank, and then if a Palestinian throws so much as a pebble against these outrages, you condemn them for terrorism, and you begin loudly endorsing Israel's right to defend itself, or as it's now put, its right and indeed its obligation to defend itself. Yes, General Petraeus of Iraq fame, and like you said, we all know how well that ended, kind of jokingly said that, you know, when he was in charge in Iraq, he offered its people gated communities and offered them to take up residence in these communities, in contrast to the U.S., for free. And I mean, those are literally concentration camps, as you mentioned. And there's also an Israeli-American businessman with far-right links. I can't recall his name at the moment, who has also proposed a detailed plan for the construction and management of these concentration camps. I believe he's presented it to both the Americans and the Israelis. You know, this is the day after plan. This is what the Americans think is going to lead to a just, durable, and comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian peace. You know, I'm sure Samantha Power and Antony Blinken and the rest of it are probably very impressed with themselves that such innovative ideas are now being put forward to ensure Palestinian rights.
I think this is further evidence that this is a war without genocide, without any aim. And I think it's exactly what Yoav Gallant said in a letter to Netanyahu recently. He said that, you know, we need to reassess the aims of the war. There is no compass that's guiding the genocide in Gaza, or the war in Lebanon, or the escalation with Iran. What is the end game here? You commit a genocide, you carry out mass murder and killing, and then what? And this is another example of, you know, how there is no end goal here, and these desperate attempts is further evidence that Israel is killing for the sake of killing, as it seems to be the case. And further evidence of that is I think South Africa would cite this, Israel's decision to ban UNRWA, and that's exactly what it's trying to do today. Israel's allies have condemned the move to ban UNRWA from Israel and also the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So this obviously is another indication of intent to commit genocide, I would say. When you think, I mean, speak to us a bit about the bill that's now passing through Israel to essentially bar UNRWA from operating in Israel and the West Bank. What was interesting for me is how it was phrased. The bill calls for UNRWA operations in the, and I quote, in the territory of the state of Israel.
Yes, because the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, territory of the state of Israel, to be basically barred. So that was for me, further confirmation that Israel thinks all of historic Palestine is Israel, and this is another sign of that.
Well, UNRWA, of course, is the main humanitarian and service agency in the region with respect to Palestinians since the 1940s, and there is nothing that can replace it. And that's precisely why its operations are now being prohibited by Israel, because nothing can replace it. I mean, if you look at this from Israel's perspective, it doesn't really make that much sense to reduce the Gaza Strip to rubble, to target and eliminate the Palestinian health sector, the Palestinian education sector, to wipe out almost 200 journalists, to conduct this entire campaign and then somehow leave the main humanitarian organization in this territory intact. And the same goes for the West Bank. So what Israel has done, it has declared UNRWA to be a terrorist organization. What else? And now is passing its parliament, with the support of the government, is passing legislation that would essentially make it illegal for UNRWA to operate in the occupied territories, meaning the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. This is unheard of, if I'm not mistaken, since the United Nations was established in 1945. I mean, the UN has had plenty of situations where it has been barred or prohibited, or staff have been blocked from entry or even murdered. But the idea that a UN member state passes parliamentary legislation, essentially outlawing a UN agency and prohibiting it from acting on the territory that that state controls, even territory that now, according to the International Court of Justice, is illegally occupied. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that's happened since the UN was established in 1945. And because this is so contentious, Israel's allies and apologists in the West have already put the United Nations on warning that if not the UN, but UN member states, meaning the General Assembly, were to take any measures to hold Israel accountable for this unprecedented, outrageous initiative, then the one who will pay the price is, of course, not Israel, but the UN itself. So now threats are being made by various Congress people in the U.S. that the UN will lose its funding and other issues and so on. So UNRWA is essentially being declared an outlaw agency. Its staff will no longer be entitled to residency permits and the other rights and privileges that they have enjoyed in this territory since UNRWA was established in 1949, 1950. And the purpose, it should be seen as part and parcel of this broader campaign. You correctly note that I think it was a G7 foreign ministers meeting issued statements not condemning Israel, but warning Israel from taking this measure. I would argue we've, now I think reached the stage, in my view, it was reached long ago, but we've certainly reached it now, where these kinds of verbal statements can and should be safely ignored. What these governments say means nothing. We need to focus exclusively on what they do. And if they make all kinds of statements of concern and admonitions to Israel and so on, and take absolutely no measures against Israel to ensure that the UN and its agencies can fulfill their mandate. And certainly, if their politicians also make all these lunatic threats against the United Nations, then their statements should really be seen as nothing more than diversions from what's really going on.
So this is a bill that's being discussed in the Israeli Knesset today, which is we're recording this on Monday, the 28th, and the show will go out on
and
the
widely
29th.
expected to pass.
That's right. And on your last point about the actions that are taken against Israel, one of the warnings from the Israeli Foreign Ministry official is that if UNRWA is banned, then Israel could face the possibility of being expelled from the UN. I mean, it seems like a measure that's far-fetched, but that's the latest report on that, from what I have read. But let's move on. Let's leave that for now. And one of the other big stories from last week, which is Israel's attack on Iran. I mean, many would argue it wasn't as big as it was anticipated. Some have said it's more of a de-escalatory move. Israel did not strike oil facilities or the nuclear facilities. Do you think that's the case? And is that the final chapter in this round of escalation between Iran and Israel?
Well, what's interesting here is that these developments quite clearly show the enormous influence that the United States has over Israel, as was very widely reported when Iran launched its unprecedented ballistic missile barrage against Israel on October 1st, in response to Israel's assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in the Iranian capital Tehran this summer, while he was an official guest of the Iranian government, attending the inauguration of its new president. Israel wanted to launch a very powerful response to that missile barrage. And, Netanyahu's dream for years has been to launch a direct attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, and to do that in a way that would embroil the United States directly into a military confrontation with Iran. What happened here is that it's quite clear Washington pulled the brakes. It told the Israelis, you are not going to embroil us in a war on the eve of a presidential election, US presidential elections. You are certainly not going to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, and you're not going to get anywhere near Iran's oil facilities. And that would, of course, both have a very disruptive effect on global energy markets. And separately, Iran had made clear to the Americans that if its own oil facilities were put out of commission, so would all the others in the Persian Gulf. So, and it was in that context that Israel, which had been talking about its attack on Iran being an unprecedented show of might and power. The world had seen nothing like this since Alexander the Great, or at least Julius Caesar. It was the lion that squeaked. It's certainly nothing that was consistent with what we had been led to believe. So, yes, I do believe that, at least from Washington's perspective, this was de-escalatory in the sense that it was a far weaker attack on Iran than had been Iran's attack on Israel on October 1st. But from Iran's perspective, of course, its sovereignty was violated yet again. What determines Iran's view of this issue is not what Washington thinks, but what Tehran thinks. And Tehran has already had made very clear that its red line was not a large Israeli attack on Iran, but any Israeli attack on Iran. And the Iranians had said that, if there was any Israeli attack, there would be an immediate and much larger Iranian response. Clearly, that hasn't materialized because the Israeli attack is now over a week old. But there are growing indications that the Iranians are ultimately not going to take this sitting down, and are determined to do something to deter Israel from continuing to launch attacks on Iranian territory. Having said that, this may be exactly what the Israelis want, because on the one hand, they now have all these additional American assets in the region, anti-missile defenses and so on. And if this Iranian-Israeli confrontation continues to escalate, then the United States, which has made very clear that it considers any Israeli attack on Iran, irrespective of its circumstances, to be an act of legitimate self-defense, and any Iranian attack on Israel, irrespective of the circumstances, an illegitimate act of aggression, it's quite clear that the U.S. cannot only defend Israel by seeking to shoot down missiles heading from Iran to Israel, and it will at one point gradually begin to get involved in direct attacks on Iran. And if that does indeed transpire, it will have achieved Israel's objective of fighting Iran directly with American power rather than the limited capabilities of Israel itself.
I want to pick up on how you began answering the previous question, which is US employing its leverage over Israel to rein in Israel's desire to carry out a much larger attack on Iran, and see that within the context of the US elections. We've seen now a number of a Muslim group, by no means most of Muslim, but a Muslim group in the US giving their backing, endorsing Donald Trump. We've seen over the last couple of hours the clown show that has been the mega event in New York, where one guest after another spewed racism and Islamophobic tropes. But despite that, this particular Muslim group endorsed Trump. But they have made it, the Democrats have made it very difficult for progressives and Muslims to offer any kind of endorsement. Harris, throughout the past 7-8 months, she's found it almost impossible, incapable of summoning any genuine empathy for the Palestinians, and backed the genocide to the hilt. And it is the genocide in Gaza and Harris's support and Biden's support for that, which will ultimately, I would think, cost them the election if polls are if we get a sense of the mood in the US at the moment. And to me, what's shocking is they've emphasized the threat to the American democracy posed by Trump. They've made the point that Trump is a fascist and his victory will be a victory for fascism. And despite that, the very thing that will stop Trump from winning, they've failed to prevent, which is to employ their leverage on Israel to stop the genocide. And they haven't done that. And I'm looking at the elections now, looking at Harris, looking at Muslims endorsing Trump, and I'm thinking, how did the Democrats allow themselves to be in this position? And my fear is that Trump is most likely going to win.
Well, given a choice between fascism and genocide, what is one to do? Just to make a few things clear, we need to distinguish between Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. Most Arab Americans are in fact not Muslims, or until recently weren't. And most Muslim Americans are not Arabs. And most importantly, this is an issue that is very much alive among not only Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, but a considerable part of the Democratic base, the progressive constituency, the youth constituency, and others. Now, this is really a problem of the Democrats' own making. They have gone out of their way to spurn, to insult, and to humiliate those of their constituents, and Arab and Muslim Americans in particular, who have been deeply engaged with this issue of trying to confront this democratic administration's full-throated, unconditional support of Israel's genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I mean, this is not a U.S.-supported genocide. The U.S. is directly complicit. One should not be allowed to mention Israel in this respect without referring to it as the U.S. armed and supported genocidal Israeli military, in my view. But, you know, you had the Democrats. So quite apart from the policies that that this administration has been pursuing, you had the Democratic National Convention over the summer, and the Arab American constituency continually lowered its criteria. In the end, it asked for just one Arab American selected by the Democratic National Committee to be allowed to give, I think, a 1-minute address. That was refused. Any approach made to the first the Biden campaign and now the Harris campaign, they're basically shown the door. They don't want dialogue. They don't want engagement. It's almost as if the one thing Trump is doing right is that he planted a secret operative in the Democratic campaign who is being extraordinarily successful in persuading these people not to vote, you know, these natural constituents of the Democratic Party, not to vote for Kamala Harris. Now, what's happened in the past week is that Trump was campaigning in Michigan. Michigan is what's called a swing state, and also one in which the opinion polls suggest the race is very close, and it's a state in which Arab Americans and Muslim Americans together could make or break the election. And these groups asked to meet with Harris. They were basically told to piss off, if I could put it that way. There will be no meeting. Who do you think you are? You know, a meeting for even 1 minute? No. They then asked to meet with Trump, who agreed. And then after the meeting, one of the members of this delegation got on stage and formally endorsed Trump. So my understanding is this was more his personal initiative rather than a decision by the group that met with him. But now we're going to be in a very strange situation where the Harris campaign, which has gone out of its way to publicly and privately demonstrate its total contempt and disdain for these constituencies, is somehow holding them responsible for Harris's electoral fortunes. I mean, you know, it used to be the case that candidates had to earn the votes of their constituents. But now Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, progressives, and others are basically being told, you know, if your sense of morality makes it impossible for you to vote for a candidate who has refused to come out publicly against genocide, well, then it's you and not me who's responsible for the consequences. It's really bizarre. It's too much for words. I mean, we're not only talking about people like some commentators or politicians who are genuinely torn about this issue and are either prepared to hold their nose and vote for Harris in order to prevent a second Trump presidency, or feel they can't do that and are either sitting out the election or voting for a third party, or in some extreme cases like the one we're discussing, even voting for Trump. I mean, we're talking about total contempt and total disdain, and actually an incredible sense of entitlement. You know, your vote belongs to me. And if you somehow use it independently according to your own political priorities and according to your own sense of morality, well, then I'm going to blame you and not my genocidal policies for the consequences. It's really incredible.
If you were to present an example of how to of a PR disaster of a party trying to win the hearts and minds of the people who are extremely angry about genocide, you would point to the Democrats. Yeah, this is the PR campaign that you don't copy, you don't do when you're trying to win the hearts and minds of a community who are very angry over genocide. And my assessment is that despite this particular Muslim endorsing Trump, the overwhelming majority of Muslims, even if they don't vote for Harris, I don't think they will be voting for Trump. They will abstain. They'll find a third party. I mean, that's my personal
I
estimation.
suspect you're right, but given the way that the U.S. electoral system is composed, where you don't need to win the vote to win the election, um, uh, not voting can prove as significant as voting for the other party.
Yeah. Let's finish on a positive story. Again, staying with the US in Washington. Lawyers in the US State Department have sent a letter to the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, pressing him to investigate violations of US law by the Israeli government, the military, and citizens of Israel, and also, citizens of Israel. And one thing that struck me in that letter, it goes on to say that US courts have jurisdiction over more than 23,000 US citizens who are currently serving in Israel's armed forces. And I didn't expect this. That's quite a large figure, 23,000 US citizens. And they're basically making the argument that America has jurisdiction over the 23,000 US citizens that are currently serving in the army, and the US should take measures to prosecute them for war crimes, crimes against humanity. So question, I didn't ask the question, but the question being, as a positive story, but I don't expect the Attorney General to be moved, of course, but there is pressure there to prosecute US soldiers and violations of US law by Israel.
Well, what the authors of this letter are basically saying, and all credit to them for doing so, is, you can't constantly pontificate about justice, about the long arm of American justice, about if you hurt an American or kill an American, we're coming after you, and then kind of look the other way and talk up Israel's rights of self-defense or Israel's ability to know what it's doing when it starts murdering journalists who have American citizenship. The idea that Americans can count on the support and assistance of their government and can be confident that if their rights are violated, the American government will come after you, except if your rights are violated by Israel, then it will, it will always come after those who violate American rights, except if the one doing the violating is Israel, then it will come after you and your family to shut up and pretend nothing happened. This letter is basically laying it out. As you mentioned, there are apparently 23,000 U.S. citizens who are serving in a genocidal army. Look at how the U.S. and, for that matter, European countries dealt with citizens who joined another genocidal movement, namely ISIS. They have been even stripped of their citizenship in some cases, and have certainly not been lauded as heroes who are engaging in legitimate acts of self-defense. With that military funded and all the rest of it. I should say there are now, I believe, 2 cases in Belgium where the Belgian government is opening investigations against citizens who have served as snipers with the Israeli military in Gaza. But as far as the United States is concerned, there's always been an exception that If it is Israel violating your rights up to and including summary execution, then we want nothing to do with you. We will ensure that the story dies a quiet death, and we're certainly not going to prosecute your killers. But you have these 23,000 who are soldiers in the Israeli military. I suspect there are many more who are illegal settlers in the West Bank, and essentially, what the authors of this letter are calling for is not so much a change in U.S. policy or anything of that nature. They're calling on the Attorney General to do his job by applying U.S. law to U.S. citizens, just as the government does in every other situation, in every other circumstance. But of course, we're here dealing with an exception, and just as the Western powers are now prepared to see the United Nations dismantled on the altar of Israeli impunity. The same is now essentially happening with U.S. domestic legislation and the rights of U.S. citizens to be protected by their own government.
And one of the asks is to prosecute Israel for killing U.S. citizens.
Don't hold your breath.
Sharon Berkeley, yeah. And it was interesting. What I found quite fascinating in the mega conference in New York, one of the speakers, Rudy Giuliani, the former New York mayor. So in one of his outbursts, he said, "We support Israel and not Palestine. Palestinians kill Americans. Hamas kills Americans." And I think if you were to count the number of Americans killed by Israel and the number of Americans killed by Palestinians, I'm not too sure, the number of Americans killed by Americans.
Look, this Israeli military unit, which Blinken, by the way, recently gave a clean bill of health and refused to sanction, so that it is still eligible for U.S. military assistance. They grabbed a 78-year-old U.S. citizen, bound and gagged him, threw him by the roadside, and the poor soul dehydrated or was beaten to death. I can't remember exactly which. One of the most prominent journalists in the region, the legendary Shireen Abu Akleh, was shot through the head by an Israeli military sniper. We're talking about a U.S. citizen. As far as the U.S. government is concerned, nothing to see here. It's really it's really incredible, exactly as you say. For many years, the U.S. will continue pursuing any and every Palestinian who was in any way connected with any harm, no matter how minor, committed against any U.S. citizen on the 7th of October. 2023. But these murders that I'm talking about and many others, they'll go into the memory hole.
So that was my guest, Moin Rabbani. Thank you, Moin, for joining me for another weekly memo review. And thank you also for tuning in. Hope to see you again next week for another roundup of the main stories from the Middle East. Bye-bye.